The forest was silent, but not with peace. It was the silence of something waiting, something unseen. Deep within the rainforest of West Africa stood one of the most powerful kingdoms of its age, Benin. Its walls stretched for miles, its bronze artworks shone like captured fire, and its people lived under the divine authority of their Oba, king, warrior, and sacred figure in one. Yet in 1897, this proud kingdom stood on the edge of destruction. The Kingdom of Benin was no ordinary realm. Nestled in what is now southern Nigeria, it was a place of order, art, and mystery. The great earthworks of Benin, walls and moats carved by human hands, were said to rival even the Great Wall of China in sheer scale. Bronze casters immortalized its rulers and victories in stunning plaques, their details so refined that centuries later, Europeans would struggle to believe such art could emerge from Africa. The heart of the kingdom beat inside Benin City. Its streets were straight and wide, its palaces filled with ivory, coral, and brass. Travelers in earlier centuries, Portuguese sailors in the 15th and 16th centuries, had written with or about this city, calling it one of the most beautiful and well-governed places in the world. But by the late 19th century, the winds of change blew with violence. Europe was no longer visiting to trade on equal terms. Instead, the scramble for Africa had begun. Britain, France, Germany, all were carving up the continent, seizing territories under the cloak of civilization. Benin, rich in palm oil, ivory, and art, stood in the way of Britain's ambitions. The British wanted open trade routes. They wanted resources flowing freely into their ports. But the Oba of Benin, Ovenramwen Nogbezi, resisted. He demanded control over what left his kingdom, just as his ancestors had. To the British, this was defiance. To the people of Benin, it was sovereignty. Imagine the tension. British traders and colonial officials, frustrated at closed markets, whispering in smoky chambers about how to bring Benin to heel. And in the forested courtyards of Benin City, chiefs and warriors swore loyalty to the Oba, vowing never to bow to foreign powers. This was no small clash. It was the meeting of two worlds, one ancient and rooted in divine kingship, the other industrial and hungry for empire. And so, by 1897, confrontation was inevitable. But here lies the haunting irony. The fall of Benin did not begin with armies marching openly. No, it began with deception. British officials disguised their intentions as diplomacy, masking conquest under the veil of negotiation. They would request visits, peace missions, and meetings, while plotting the destruction of a kingdom that had stood for centuries. The forest remembers, the Edo people often say, even if men forget. That forest would soon witness one of the most brutal encounters of the colonial age, the invasion and burning of Benin City. But before the flames, there was still pride, still dignity, still the Oba, seated in his coral regalia, ruling from the heart of a kingdom that believed itself unshakable. Little did they know, the storm was coming. Wars are not always born on the battlefield. Sometimes, they begin at a table, with false smiles, hidden knives, and promises never meant to be kept. By the dawn of 1897, Britain had grown restless. Palm oil, ivory, and rubber were flowing across West Africa, but Benin stood stubbornly apart. The Oba, Ovenramwen Nogbezi, maintained strict control of trade, refusing to surrender his kingdom's sovereignty. To the British, this was more than inconvenience, it was defiance. So, a plan was devised. In January of that year, a peace mission was proposed. Acting Consul General James Robert Phillips, along with a party of colonial officials and traders, claimed they would travel to Benin City simply to negotiate. They spoke of friendship, diplomacy, and easing tensions. On paper, it sounded harmless. But the truth was darker. Documents later revealed that Phillips had already requested British troops and warships in anticipation of a military expedition. His so-called peace mission was merely the first step in provoking a confrontation. Back in Benin, the atmosphere was uneasy. The Oba and his chiefs were in the midst of the Igu festival, a sacred period when the king was secluded in rituals of renewal. According to custom, visitors, especially foreigners, were strictly forbidden at this time. It was not mere protocol. It was a matter of spiritual and cultural survival. When word reached the palace that a British delegation was marching toward the city despite warnings, alarm spread. Chief after chief rose in the council, their coral beads rattling as they spoke. Oba, we warned them. We told them to wait. Yet still they come. It is a trick, my lord. They seek to spy upon us, to test our strength. The Oba, caught between tradition and diplomacy, hesitated. He was a ruler who valued the sanctity of his people's customs, but he also knew the wrath of empire could be unforgiving. He reportedly urged restraint, but his chiefs saw the danger more clearly. On the dusty paths leading into the forest, the British mission advanced. Phillips, a small entourage of officials, and African porters. They were unarmed with heavy weapons, but their intentions were no secret to the watchful eyes of Benin's warriors. Then came the spark. On January 4, 1897, as the British party pressed deeper into Edo territory, Benin warriors ambushed them. The forest exploded with arrows, spears, and musket fire. Most of the expedition was wiped out. Phillips himself was killed in the chaos. Only a handful of survivors staggered back to tell the tale. To the Benin people, it was a defense of sovereignty, a response to provocation. To the British, it was painted as a massacre, an unprovoked slaughter of innocent envoys. And just like that, the excuse Britain needed was in hand. News of the ambush thundered across colonial offices. Politicians in London seized upon it, declaring that Benin must be punished. Newspapers fanned the flames, describing Benin as a barbaric kingdom hostile to progress and civilization. But strip away the propaganda, and the reality remained. Britain had long prepared for this outcome. The ambush at Yucatan was not the cause of war, but the trigger Britain had been waiting for. As January turned to February, warships steamed toward the coast. Hundreds of Marines, soldiers, and African auxiliaries assembled, armed with Maxim guns, rifles, and heavy artillery. Their orders were clear: invade Benin City, crush its resistance, and bring the Oba to submission. In the courtyards of Benin, drums beat like thunder. Chiefs swore oaths before ancestral shrines. Warriors sharpened their blades, ready to fight not just for their Oba, but for the very soul of their kingdom. The air was heavy with dread and defiance. Both sides knew a storm was coming. And in that storm, one of Africa's most remarkable kingdoms would face its darkest trial. Imagine the forest trembling with the thunder of cannons. Imagine flames climbing into the night sky, devouring centuries of art, memory, and pride. This was the Siege of Benin. The invasion begins. On February 9, 1897, the British punitive expedition began its march. Over 1,200 soldiers and marines, supported by carriers and auxiliaries, pushed into the dense Edo forests. At their disposal were modern weapons, Maxim machine guns, Martini Henry rifles, and heavy artillery. Against them, Benin's warriors carried muskets, spears, and poisoned arrows, weapons of courage, but not of equal power. The Edo forest, thick and shadowed, became the first battlefield. Benin warriors knew their land intimately. They staged ambushes, firing from cover, then disappearing like spirits into the undergrowth. They struck with ferocity, determined to protect their kingdom. Yet the British marched with cold precision. Each ambush was answered with volley after volley of gunfire, the crack of rifles tearing through the silence. Where resistance was strong, the Maxim guns were unleashed, spewing hundreds of rounds a minute, mowing down warriors in swaths. The forest floor was littered with broken spears, shattered drums, and bodies. As the expedition advanced, villages were torched. The thatched roofs of Edo homes went up in flames, smoke curling above the canopy. Families fled into the bush with only what they could carry. Crops were destroyed, shrines desecrated. The British commander, Admiral Harry Rawson, had given explicit orders: destroy Benin's capacity to resist. It was not just a war on warriors. It was a war on the very foundations of the kingdom. For every village that resisted, the fire followed. For every shrine that offered prayers, silence fell. By the third week of February, the expedition reached the great capital itself, Benin City. For centuries, it had stood as a marvel of West Africa. A city of wide streets, bustling markets, towering mud brick walls, and the famed palace complex, adorned with bronze plaques and ivory masterpieces. Now, it became the heart of the storm. Benin's warriors rallied in defense, drums beating in defiance. They lined the city's outer walls, muskets loaded, arrows notched. The Oba himself, Oven Ramwan Nogbezi, remained in ritual seclusion but sent word of encouragement. The ancestors would fight alongside their sons. The battle raged at the city's gates. Gunfire echoed through the streets. Smoke from British artillery darkened the sky. The defenders fought bravely, but the technological gulf was too wide. Where 100 Edo muskets fired once, the Maxim spat 1,000 bullets in reply. One British officer later wrote, "The resistance was desperate. The enemy fought with the courage of men defending their homes. But courage was no match for science." After hours of fierce fighting, the British broke through. Soldiers poured into the city, bayonets fixed, rifles at the ready. The clash became house to house, shrine to shrine. Warriors fell, chiefs were cut down, women and children scattered in terror. Then came the fire. The great palace of Benin, the seat of centuries of kings, the repository of art and history, was set ablaze. Flames licked the carved pillars, the coral-studded thrones, the sacred altars of the ancestors. The crackle of burning would mingled with the cries of the dying. Bronze plaques depicting battles, rituals, and kings were torn from the walls. Ivory tusks, masks, and carved treasures were piled high, seized as war booty. These were not just ornaments. They were the very soul of Benin, artworks that told the story of its people. And now, they were stolen, destined for museums and private collections in Europe. By the time the smoke cleared, Benin City lay in ruins. Its streets were littered with bodies, its shrines desecrated, its palace reduced to smouldering ash. The once mighty kingdom, feared and respected across West Africa, had been brought low. The Oba fled into the forest, hunted but not captured, not yet. His chiefs, many of them killed, could not rally the kingdom again. The siege was over. Benin had fallen. But in the silence that followed, amidst the ruin, one truth remained. This was not just a conquest. It was the violent erasure of a culture, the deliberate breaking of a people's spirit, an act of empire masked as civilization. The guns fell silent, the flames died down. But what remained was not victory. It was silence. A silence heavy with loss. The kingdom of Benin was no more. In the weeks after the destruction of Benin City, the British intensified their search for the king, Oba Oven Ramwan Nogbezi. The Oba, stripped of his city, had fled deep into the forests with a small retinue. For months, he evaded capture, moving between hidden camps, sustained by loyal chiefs and villagers who risked their lives to shelter him. But by August 1897, betrayal and exhaustion forced his hand. He emerged, not as a warrior, but as a king humbled by fate. Eyewitnesses recalled that when he surrendered, he did so with quiet dignity. He offered coral beads, the sacred insignia of kingship, and asked only that his people be spared further suffering. But the empire was gone. The Oba was exiled to Calabar, far from the land of his ancestors, where he lived out his days until his death in 1914. Perhaps the most infamous legacy of the invasion was the looting. British soldiers carted away over 4,000 artworks, bronze plaques, ivory carvings, coral regalia, and ceremonial objects that had adorned the palace for centuries. These were not just treasures, they were history cast in metal. The bronzes told the story of Benin's kings, their battles, their rituals, their diplomacy with Europe. Each plaque was a record, a library in bronze. Shipped to London, they were sold at auctions, displayed in museums, and scattered across Europe and America. Today, they reside in institutions like the British Museum, the Ethnological Museum of Berlin, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. For decades, they were admired as exotic art. But to the Edo people, they were stolen memories, torn from the soul of their kingdom. The fall of Benin was more than a local tragedy. It was a symbol of the age, the brutal advance of empire across Africa in the late 19th century. The British justified their actions as punishment for barbarism. They claimed they had brought civilization. But the evidence of fire, looting, and cultural erasure tells another story. This was conquest, pure and simple. The fall of Benin opened the door for deeper colonial control of southern Nigeria. The once proud kingdom became a province of the British Protectorate of Southern Nigeria, and later, part of colonial Nigeria. Yet, Benin's story did not end in 1897. The kingdom's culture survived in memory, ritual, and pride. The royal line was eventually restored, not as an independent empire, but as a traditional monarchy within modern Nigeria. Today, the Oba of Benin still reigns as a custodian of Edo heritage and the stolen bronzes. In recent years, they have become the center of global debate. Nigeria has called for their return, and slowly, museums are beginning to repatriate some of these treasures. Each returned artifact is not just art, it is a piece of history, a piece of healing. The Fall of Benin stands as one of the darkest chapters in Africa's encounter with European empire. It shows how a proud, sophisticated civilization could be reduced to ashes in the name of profit and power. But it also carries lessons. It reminds us that no kingdom, however mighty, is immune to change. It warns us about the cost of division, of underestimating the world beyond our borders. And most of all, it reminds us of the resilience of culture, for though Benin burned, its spirit did not die. When you look at the Benin Bronzes today, gleaming in glass cases far from home, remember this: they are not just artifacts. They are survivors. Survivors of fire, conquest, and exile. Survivors of a kingdom that once stood proud, and whose story still echoes across time. The Kingdom of Benin may have fallen in 1897, but its memory will never be erased.